Good evening, and welcome to the Way Out Show. I'm your host, Dane McCarthy, broadcasting to you from FEMA Region 5, deep in the bowels of the United Police State of Amnesia. Today is January 26th, 2017. We're only a few days into the Trump presidency, and already Trump is attempting, and in some ways succeeding to move forward with his agenda. And he has actually talked about building the wall and moved and taken some initial steps toward building the wall. Now, he set up a meeting with the Mexican president, but he tweeted that if the Mexican president is not willing to pay for the wall, then he can cancel the meeting. And so the Mexican president actually called his bluff and canceled the meeting. So he's getting nowhere with that. And with of course, the Mexican president and the former, I don't remember his name, but Vicente Fox, the former Mexican president, who seems still to have a lot of cred with the media, said Mexico will never pay for the effing wall, in a quote. And the new president is following in Vicente Fox's footsteps and saying that they will never pay. Now, Trump's attitude is that Mexico will pay one way or the other, whether directly or indirectly. And I could actually see how this could possibly happen by putting punishing tariffs on Mexico if they do not help with the construction charges, the costs, because the cost of building the wall is billions of dollars. Now, it's not that the United States could not afford to do this, because let's not forget the United States essentially wasted between $5 and $6 trillion on fighting several wars since 2001, since 9/11. Now, it is also true that a lot of multinational corporations, private contractors, mercenary groups, weapons manufacturers are making a killing from war profiteering, as well as politicians and certain corrupt military people. They're making fortunes off war. War has always been good for certain members of our global society. Probably the people and the entities who make the most profits off war are the big banks, the major banks. They're the ones who loan the money to the government of the various countries. And they've done this ever since really the creation of the international banking cartel of the world's biggest banks. Now, your small local hometown bank is far less likely to benefit and gain largesse and be able to loot the American people through its ability to loan large amounts of money through using fractional banking system, which is essentially an illegal and very unfair system. Fractional banking means that you can lend more money at the rate of 10 to 1. In other words, you can loan out 10 times the money that you actually have on reserve, that is actually in your vaults. So you're creating money. You're giving people a check, which is a bad check, but because it's written on your bank, I mean, they will honor, other banks will honor that check. And what it does is that check, the money that is spent out of nothing, that is created out of nothing by that bad check, is eventually paid for by the taxpayers, by the people with the real assets, with real money. The people eventually have to pay that in the form of inflation. and other ways, and higher taxation to cover those costs. Those costs always come back to get the people who are the honest people. So the dishonest people are robbing from the honest people. And you have criminality at the very highest levels. And this is why war works for certain people. Unfortunately, war also is the most destructive force on this planet. I mean, you have the corrupt government and the corrupt media and the corrupt multinational corporations telling us that the most destructive force on the planet, the most destructive thing that's happening, the most dangerous by far, is carbon dioxide. They actually have about 50% of the American people convinced that carbon dioxide is a greater danger than military force, than the empire builders and the destroyers of empire, the mercenary armies that are destroying enormous parts of the world, and those areas will really never be safe to live in again, ever. You might think, well, you could just rebuild, and that could be good for business. You destroy a town in Syria or Lebanon or Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya or Jordan or Pakistan or Yemen. You destroy a town in any one of those areas or any other country that they decide to bomb and destroy, Panama. You can go back in history and look at the history of U.S. and NATO and its allies bombing, and you could say, well, we could just rebuild those, and wouldn't that be good for business? Because you have to hire people, you have to get the materials, you have to get the contractors, the corporations, everybody. It's a win-win. You get a new city, but there's only one problem with that. Since the 90s, the U.S. government and its allies, and now more and more militaries around the world, are using depleted uranium in ordnance, 50 caliber and above. And you might say, oh, it's depleted. Well, that shouldn't be too bad. Wrong. You have enriched uranium, and then you have the leftovers, which is called depleted uranium. And whenever you make enriched uranium, you have depleted uranium. And what do you do with the depleted uranium? It's still radioactive. It's still dangerous. It's still got the potential to cause cancer, to kill. And what do you do with it? Well, let's decide. Let's figure out what we're going to do. Oh, I know. How about, since it's so heavy, it can pierce about anything, and it explodes, it aerosolizes without requiring explosives to be added to it. It just explodes on its own. I don't exactly know how it works completely, but it's the preferred metal to use. It's really heavy, and it also has the added benefit of being radioactive. So your enemies will always be irradiated, and you will be killing your enemies, usually babies or fetuses in the womb, or causing severe birth defects, horrible monsters, or women give birth to these monsters as a direct result of the radioactivity, which causes mutations. And you have this situation now where places like Aleppo, I mean, yeah, they may rebuild Aleppo, or any of these other cities and countries that they've laid waste to and are continuing to do so. around the world, but they will always be radioactive. It will always be in the dust. You can't really get rid of it. It's in the water, it's in the air, it's in the land itself, and it's just spread around the world more and more. And you couple that with the radioactivity of the meltdowns, and you have a large portion of Ukraine now permanently radioactive as a result of Chernobyl back in the 80s. And then you have the Fukushima, which the meltdown there, that's another source of radioactivity. It went up, and the radioactivity went up into the stratosphere and spread around the world, just like what happened with Chernobyl. That increases the level of radioactivity. Then you have whole areas, of course, around Fukushima that are off limits to humans. They're not safe. So Japan, a highly populated country, now must deal with the reality that they've lost part of their country. And some people say that all of Japan is radioactive now. They're not telling people that, and that will continue to kill for hundreds, thousands of years, just like in other places around the world. You have certain places out west that are still radioactive from nuclear testing in the 50s. And we're not supposed to know about that, but it's true. There's still radioactivity. You have little traces of it, and it doesn't take much, though. You see, if you inhale it and it gets lodged in your lung, a tiny microscopic particle of radioactive material, and it just sits there and radiates you in that one spot. And so you get lung cancer or something like that. Just keeps after you. A lot of people think John Wayne. It's pretty much been established that John Wayne was killed because he made a movie out in Utah in an area that a few years before had been used for atomic testing. And it was supposed to be in a desert location. And just about everybody, the actors and the people who were doing the production, like the director and the other people who were involved in creating that movie, all died of cancer, including John Wayne, Agnes Moorehead, and other people who were involved in filming that movie. It was called The Conqueror. It was about Genghis Khan back in the 50s. But this is just one example of how it continues to be a danger. And yet, we are told by the government that it's carbon dioxide, that we're going to have 20-foot sea level rise by the end of the 21st century. And it's going to just change the world as we know it. And they keep saying it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. But the years keep ticking by. And they say, well, the poles are melting. Well, then we look at the poles and they're fine. And they say, oh, the polar bears are going extinct. Except when you actually look at the numbers, there are more polar bears now than there were like back in the 60s. The polar bears are fine. They're not in danger of going extinct. So this is, and then when you couple that with scandals, lies, threats against anyone, the scandals, involving the lies, because many researchers do not agree with the computer models that come up with this prediction that we're going to get this high level of destruction as a result of global warming. Remember, global warming started with James Hansen. He's the guy that came up with the idea, and he believes it to this day. He's retired now. and he's very angry. He came up, James Hansen, he worked for NASA, he was a climatologist. He came up with the notion, with the research, which a lot of people do not agree with, that a rise in carbon dioxide levels leads to an increase in global warming. But many researchers and scientists and meteorologists and climatologists do not agree with that. The idea that 95% of scientists believe that global warming is caused by carbon dioxide is a lie. It's simply not true. And there's been a concerted effort to shut down and prevent people from being published in legitimate scientific journals their research that shows that it's simply not true. The reality, according to these scientists who are dissenters from the government line, is that it is the opposite. Carbon dioxide does not cause global warming. Global warming causes a rise in carbon dioxide. It's the other way around. And why would that be? And you might say, well, what does cause global warming? Well, there are many factors. Number one is the sun. By far, the major controller of global warming and cooling is the sun. Now, who would have thought? I mean, how could that be? The sun, but that's this little tiny thing way out there, this little tiny golden, shiny object way out there. It's so far away. How far away is it? It's like, is it even in the solar system, the sun? And it's gone at night. It doesn't even exist. It doesn't even heat, people have this crazy idea that the sun has no effect on the planet. Folks, there would not be any life on Earth if it were not for the sun. The sun is the driver of planet Earth. The sun controls the Earth. I mean, I hate to bust your bubble, but it's not humans who control the weather. Now, there are certain things that we can do, that human beings can do. They can use chemicals and little specks of like sulfur dioxide, things like this, that they spew out into the stratosphere to temporarily affect the weather a little bit. They can change it a little bit. They can prevent it from raining. They can cause it to rain, and it's a form of cloud seeding. And you have the geoengineering that's been this program, a secret program, supposedly secret, even though if you look up in the sky, you could see it on certain days, where the whole sky is just crisscrossed with a network, like a spider web of trails, of chemtrails. That's called stratospheric geoengineering. It's 30,000 feet. Military airplanes, specially equipped, spewing out sulfates, barium, and a few other little crystalline structures that just sort of hang there in the sky. And they're using that they have multiple purposes for it. There is some debate about what the purpose of it is. Like I said, it may have multiple purposes. One of them is essentially defertilizing the land, taking the ability of crops, poisoning the land essentially, poisoning America, preventing the crops from growing. Because if you can cause people to starve, then you can control those people. If you can control the production of food, then you can control the people. And this is what the people who want America to no longer exist want. They want to destroy America. Once you destroy the United States of America, these United States of America, the world's longest running democracy in the form of a republic, then you have destroyed the most successful experiment in a very newfangled idea that the people would actually run their own lives and elect representatives rather than having a king, having a queen, having an emperor, rather than having the wealthy run the show and have complete godlike power. To take that power away from those godlike beings that have run the human race since the beginning of civilization. And take that away and return it. That if you can destroy America, then you will have a much easier time knocking off the world's remaining democracies. And the people at the very top have wanted this for a very long time. They've never been comfortable with democracy. They're not used to it. They don't like it. They believe they're superior beings anyway. And they feel like they deserve to run the planet. Now, you already have people who run the planet. And they're not even, those are the people that are not even mentioned in the news. I find it quite hilarious. I saw an article not that long ago about, what was it, the 8 richest men in the world. So you have 8 men, and Warren Buffett was in there, Bill Gates, of course, and several others. And I was thinking to myself, you know, these are not even the world's richest men. These are the people who work for the world's richest men. No representative of the Rockefeller family was in that list. I'm thinking, where are the Rockefellers? They're not even mentioned. These people are trillionaires, not just billionaires. And they had a list of all 8 men, and with how much money that they were worth. You know, like Warren Buffett is 60 billion, and then Bill Gates is 50 billion, and you know, so on. Zuckerberg, he's like 30 billion, who knows? You know, something like that. Doesn't even matter. The numbers, what are these are meaningless. They just make up stuff. No member of the Rothschild family was even mentioned in that list. And yet those guys, Rockefellers and the Rothschilds, and a few other families, own the world's biggest banks. They're banking families, and they've owned banks for many, many generations. The Rothschilds have been around since the 1700s. They got their biggest coup back in about 1806 at the Battle of Waterloo, where they essentially bought up most of Great Britain and Europe because they were the smartest guys in the room and took advantage of the inability of the messengers to communicate who had actually won the Battle of Waterloo. Now, for those history buffs out there, the Battle of Waterloo spelled the end of Napoleon Bonaparte at the hands of the British and their allies under Wellington. And that was a touch-and-go battle. But eventually, Wellington won, and Napoleon lost. And you could see how, since Napoleon was the master of Europe at that time, he crowned himself emperor of Europe. When he lost, that changed everything. And so the stock markets would go up or down depending on who won that battle. Well, Rothschild's agents got the news to Rothschild quicker than anybody else. So he had the true story, and he acted accordingly. And he was in the stock exchange in London, and he started selling stocks, and he got everyone knew that his messenger got there first and whispered in his ear who had won. And he did the opposite. He tricked them. And then, so they started selling too, as the price started to fall. Everything, the price of everything in Great Britain, practically. And he had other guys who were buying up those stocks at the rock bottom prices. And then the next messenger came in and told everybody that Wellington and the British had won. And so suddenly the stock soared to even higher than it had been before. And at that moment, Rothschild became master of much of Europe. The Rothschild family has now taken all their names off their buildings, out of the news, and this has been going on for decades. Decades. I don't know when it was that they originally took their name off, but the name Rothschild 100 years ago was used a lot. It was in the news. They had it on their banks and different holdings. There was Rothschild this, but they decided at some point that they needed to withdraw into the shadows, out of the public spotlight. And now that is so ingrained that most people have never even heard of the name Rothschild. Young people, never heard of it. Can you imagine the most wealthy family in the entire planet completely off the radar for most people? 99.9% have never heard of the Rothschilds. Now, if you were to do a search online, you could find out their whole story. It's there because virtually everything, all human knowledge now seems to be, not all of it, but most of it is now available because there's so many people who record everything on this incredible World Wide Web. And there are people out there who will, where you can find the history. I mean, there was literally Hollywood movies made about what I just told you about. There was a movie called The Rothschild. It was Rothschild something or other, about that very event which I just described to you. Literally a Hollywood movie back in the, 40s, 50s. I even saw it, or part of it. You can look at it online. And it tells essentially that story that I just told you. It's not made up. So people have to understand that there is a lot more going on than what they're going to hear about on CNN or MSNBC or ABC or National Public Radio or PBS. You're only getting a tiny, tiny thin veneer of information that is highly selective. There's a lot of news and there's a lot of information out there that's available. And this is why the mainstream media, the government-controlled, the corporate-controlled press is failing. People are losing interest. They're losing faith in this controlled, highly controlled, and very biased media. And it will behoove people to go to citizen journalists around the world. They will gain so much information that they will be absolutely amazed, and it will help them. It will help anyone who looks and does research. You must do research. You must find out for yourself. Decide for yourself. Don't rely on other people's word for it. Don't rely on my word for it or any other single person. You must do your own research and decide for yourself whether something is true. And there's a lot of talk about fake news, and the mainstream corporate controlled media, who are major purveyors of fake news, are trying to tar alternative media with this label of fake news. And it is failing. It is already failing. And the purveyors of fake news are the people who are desperate to try to keep their control and keep people believing in them and watching them. But more and more people are turning away. Their numbers are going down. Even the New York Times is failing. It is cutting staff. It is cutting budgets. Their advertisers are losing interest in spending huge amounts of money to get to advertise in the New York Times. And why shouldn't they? Because people aren't reading the New York Times. They just aren't reading it. Older people are hanging on to media outlets like the New York Times, the New Yorker, MSNBC, ABC, and all these networks because they remember it as being reliable news sources, so they thought, back in the 50s or 60s or 70s or even into the 80s. But now it's all different. It's a whole different world. The people, the honest journalists who ran those news outlets back down like the Washington Post, they're gone. They're long gone. They're retired, they're dead, they've been fired, they've been kicked out. They've been replaced by young guns, hot shots with an agenda, who believe that they must do the bidding of their owners. And who are the owners? The owner class. The people who, and they're looking out for their own best interests. And there are only a small group of people who own the major media outlets. And, they try to put on a facade of being unbiased. Fox News, Fox News has its own bias. But we have to look at the people who are not getting paid. They have nothing to lose by telling the truth, or they're getting paid very little. The citizen journalists, and maybe they are biased, but one thing you can do is sometimes people with a bias will tell you the truth about the people that they're biased against. Then you can look at the people they're biased against, and they will tell the truth about the people they're biased against. So that's two different, completely separate points of view. They're both biased, but they're both telling the truth about the other side. And maybe some places they won't tell the truth, and then you can have to compare them and decide, well, is that the truth? Let's look at this video. Is this video telling us that they're claiming this as evidence? Is this really telling us what they're saying this means, or does this mean something else? And one thing you can do is you can read one of the great things about the World Wide Web is you can read the comments on something like YouTube in a video that is claiming to tell you something. You can read the comments, and you can get an idea of whether or not people think this is phony or this is real. And you can read hundreds and hundreds of comments, some of them very detailed, from people maybe who were in a position to know one way or the other whether or not that particular video clip is relevant or is real or says what it claims that it says. You can learn. We're learning machines. Human beings are learning machines, and we need to use our brains as learning machines in order to discern the difference between false reality and real reality. This is essential. And those people who can discern reality they have a huge advantage. And it's not just a physical advantage. It's not just a monetary advantage, but it is an advantage because the universe is real. The universal power has reality as its basis, as its foundation. And if we can get close to reality, the way things really are, you're essentially getting closer to that universal power. And that universal power has, just like it says, power. It is the power of understanding, the power of awareness, the power of whatever is good in the universe, whether it would be patience, when patience is required, or strength, when strength is required, and all that is good and helpful to a human being is available in the universe. Once a person is approaching that universal power and feeling that in their heart, they become more and more allergic to lies, to falsehoods. Not that you would never be tricked, but you're better at it. You get better at it. You can feel it. You can begin to feel what feels true. You become more in touch with that inner place inside of you that has instincts, has a natural instinct. Like a child can sense, a bad person, someone who's a threat, who may be acting very nice, but is still a threat. They sense that. And we lose that as adults. Very often we lose that. We're not in touch with it. We have so many ideas and so many notions and so much conditioning. And we're all under a certain level of hypnosis, a trance-like state that puts us to sleep. And we want to be out of that. We want to be pulled up out of that. We want to be aware. We want to be using our faculties to be able to tell the difference. And so we're operating on a higher level than we're supposed to be by those very powerful influences that want to keep people under their thumb. And why? And why would they do that, you might say? They do that because it's to their benefit. It is in their best interests. And who is they? Those moneyed power people who want to keep what they have. They have a lot already, probably more than they could ever use, and yet it's still not enough. They will never have enough. They will always push to consolidate and increase their gains that they have made. Just like the military, just like the politicians, just like the big bankers, just like the multinational corporation people, who when we when a lot of people like Ron Paul talked about just walking away from Afghanistan, walking away from Iraq. Okay, we've gone in, we've destroyed those countries. We own those countries. Like Colin Powell said, you break it, you own it. And people go, oh, that sounds bad. You know, we shouldn't break them. But other people is like going, yeah, let's break it and then we'll own it. Cool. That's what we want. Just like those people who said, hey, look, why would we ever want to leave Iraq and Afghanistan? Why would we ever want to do that after all the gains we made? I mean, we spent trillions of dollars to conquer and control and occupy these countries. And we're just going to walk away? No way, we're not going to do that. And that's why Barack Obama, you know, he was elected and he said, I will stop it. I will end it. You know, I will bring the boys back. You know, he said what people wanted to hear. So it's almost, and yet he didn't do that. He expanded the drone program. We're bombing in multiple countries, in more countries than most Americans even know about. We're expending ordnance in those countries. We're killing civilians. We're killing children. We're killing old men and old women and all kinds of people in all kinds of different countries. You know, from Pakistan over into Africa. The number is 7. I don't have all of them, but secret bombing, covert bombing. Yemen is apparently being destroyed right now. It's not even on the news. That's because Saudi Arabia wants it to be destroyed. It's being erased as a country, essentially, supposedly. Saudi Arabia, of course, is supporting ISIL, Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, and all these other groups that are trying to overthrow Assad, the Assad regime in Syria. And the United States is selling Saudi Arabia weapons. They're arming directly and indirectly with military, humanitarian aid, these rebel groups, because they also, under the Obama administration, continued the George W. Bush policy of taking out these countries. And hey, Syria was on the list. Libya, Iraq, Syria, eventually Iran. That's down the road. That's the big one. That's the big one right now. So Trump is trying to walk us back from this George W. Bush policy and Dick Cheney and the neocon policy for world domination. Getting that foothold in Central Asia by conquering and occupying Afghanistan. Afghanistan being the keystone country in Central Asia. You must have Afghanistan if you want to control Central Asia. Same thing with Iraq. If you want to control Middle East, you must have Iraq. It's centrally located. Borders on several other countries. You look at the map of the world, you can see why they chose those two countries. Had nothing to do with 9/11. Neither one of those invasions had anything to do with 9/11. Osama bin Laden had nothing to do with 9/11. This was a smokescreen. This is the cover story. 9/11 was about getting the American people ready for the next big military push in the establishment of American control of the world and its allies for the 21st century. That's why they chose very, very carefully. It was planned for years. And they got the technology together to make the drone aircraft that flew into the buildings. And they had to have had some way they controlled those. They did some kind of, either those were very hardened airplanes, but they were not the jumbo jets that they said they were, because those jumbo jets would never have just slid like a knife through butter into those twin towers. That's impossible. Those jumbo jets are very lightly constructed. They have to be. They're made mostly with aluminum. So you have aluminum hitting huge girders, steel girders. They would just, the nose of those airplanes would just crumple. Those wings would just break and crumple and crush, again, with the force and power of those airplanes slamming into the building. They wouldn't just neatly just pop right in. So something was going on with those airplanes, with explosives in those buildings. They were set up somehow to make those holes so those airplanes could enter those buildings and smoothly enter. Some people say they were even like holograms or something. Amazing high-tech images of airplanes. But those holes do exist, so something made those holes. Like one of the holes was like in the actual image of an airplane. It was like a cartoon or something, like where the cartoon character runs through a door or a window or a wall, and you make an outline of that character as he busts right through that wall. And it's a cartoon. It could never happen like that in real life. But that's a similar situation in which you have a very lightweight, lightly constructed aluminum, essentially mostly aluminum airplane hitting a heavy-duty, very strongly made building. The tallest building in the world at that time, the Twin Towers. And you have to be strong. You have to be really strong. They tried to topple the Twin Towers back in the 90s with a truck bomb in the basement. And they were unable to do it because of the strength of that building. But we know that the buildings, the Twin Towers, were completely rigged anyway. So I suppose it's possible that they could have rigged just incredible explosives right exactly where those planes were going to hit. So they would just go right in. I mean, if they're able to rig a building from the top to the bottom with nanothermite that cut steel in a matter of seconds, you know, they could certainly just make a hole appear in the side of a building in the exact shape of an airplane, just at the exact moment. It's hard to believe. But the technology is amazing what they have. Most people are way, way behind in their understanding of what technology is capable of doing. But there's no other possible way that the Twin Towers could have fallen. And, of course, Building 7, the third tower that fell without an airplane hitting it on 9/11, into a neat pile, just a completely straight down collapse at free fall speed, literally free fall. Just meeting no resistance at all on the way down, just straight down, boom, right down to the ground. And all the concrete, tons and untold tons of concrete, aerosolized and spread in a layer of powder all over lower Manhattan. There's only one way that could possibly have happened, and that is with unimaginable amounts of high explosives. Bodies, very, very few bodies, actual bodies found at the base of where the Twin Towers stood. There was nobody in Building 7 when it fell later that afternoon. Tiny body parts, people blown to smithereens in that pile. Maybe somebody's arm found, a part of their arm. That would not have happened in the official explanation for the collapse of the Twin Towers, which doesn't even take into account Building 7, doesn't even talk about it, pretends it didn't even happen. The official report. The official reason for why the Twin Towers fell is a pancake collapse, which means that it's like a stack of pancakes. It falls, the floors collapse, each floor collapses onto the next floor, onto the next floor, onto the next floor, all the way down. And so that wouldn't have the force to blow those bodies apart into little pieces. They would be trapped in between the floors. And you can see on the videos, many videos showing both buildings collapsing, that it's not a pancake collapse because it's so perfect. Both buildings. Remember, these were the tallest buildings in the world. I went up in those buildings. I saw them. I went up and looked around, and just amazing, amazing construction. And you can look at the videos of how they were actually built. Very innovative, extremely strong, flexible. They moved in the wind. They were not brittle. They were made to withstand a strike by a jumbo jetliner. They took that into account. They knew that there was a possibility that they could be hit by an airplane. An airplane had to actually hit the Empire State Building back during World War II. The Empire State Building, you know, it was the tallest building in the world for a long time, and you know, it caused a fire. It didn't destroy the building, and it was like a lightweight bomber. It was like a B-25 or something, a medium weight bomber, and so there's a lot that people need to realize. I mean, getting back to that bias, the idea of the bias factor that's so prevalent today. The New York Times is clearly anti-Trump. The Washington Post is clearly anti-Trump. And most of the other mainstream outlets are clearly anti-Trump. And why is that? The Democrat establishment is, of course, naturally anti-Trump, but also the Republican establishment is anti-Trump. So all of the establishment, or much of it, was anti-Trump, and yet Trump won. So what's going on? Was it just a bunch of idiots, a racist, white supremacist idiots? Half the country are white supremacist, sexist, misogynistic idiots who are white supremacists who voted for Trump? And this is literally how half the country is being labeled by the mainstream media over and over. And they haven't even stopped. They haven't even given up. They have toned it back quite a bit because they were saying that Trump was a psychopath, that he was a maniac. They compared him to Hitler. They said he was incompetent. They said he was a clown. They used that a lot. They laughed. They laughed about him that he could ever be president, that he was unfit to do the job. And he had all of these strikes against him, and yet people just ignored that. People just ignored all these warnings, and they voted for him anyway. And so far, we're not far into his presidency, but he doesn't appear to be a psychopath as far as I could see. He doesn't appear to be stupid or incompetent or unfit. You know, as far as his sexual proclivities, look at Bill Clinton, and he got to be president. I mean, you talk about a sex addict, that's been established. Trump doesn't smoke, drink, or take drugs. He's married to a very beautiful woman. Why would he be involved in all this stuff that the mainstream media is saying? So it's lies. So that's all for today. Have a great weekend and sleep well.